Alright, so today we are looking at the Nixon administration. Alright, so here are President Nixon and Vice President Agnew and their wives, First and Second Lady. So Nixon's goals were to limit the power of the federal government, reduce its power, and reverse Johnson's liberal policies. He also wants to restore America's prestige and influence in the world, to fix Vietnam, but we've already talked about Nixon's role in Vietnam. He wants to decrease the size and influence of the federal government for new federalism, where they distribute some of the federal power to state and local levels, and revenue sharing, where more financial freedom is given for local governments. And state and local governments can now spend their federal money however they saw fit. Second, inefficiency of the welfare system. So welfare reform, you had the Family Assistance Plan, or the FAP, which was a plan to give a family of four up to $1,600 a year, but they could also earn supplemental income up to $4,000. If you were an unemployed participant, you would have to take job training or any reasonable job. But this bill was defeated, and both liberals and conservatives attacked it very high. New federalism has two faces, and Nixon needed support of Democrats, but also wanted to reduce liberal programs. But he realized he couldn't defeat some liberal programs, so he used a policy of impoundment, where he withheld the necessary funds needed. Federal courts ordered the end of impounding, though, and unable to have him be able to do that. On the election of '68, Nixon promised to get out of Vietnam and restore law and order. So here's some of the ways he tried to restore law and order: by wiretapping liberals through the FBI, having the IRS audit anti-war and civil rights activists, and he compiled an enemies list. Nixon was probably a little paranoid. If you have to have an enemies list, then you must be paranoid. Alright. Vice President Spiro Agnew confronted the liberal media. Nixon tried to get support from white Southern Democrats who were unhappy with federal desegregation policies and a liberal Supreme Court. He also favored slow desegregation in 1969, and he ordered the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to delay segregation in Mississippi and South Carolina, which was overturned by the Supreme Court. And desegregation through school busing also became a civil rights issue, whereas whites in Detroit and Boston opposed it. Nixon was also opposed to it. You can see, stop busing now. We don't want to integrate. Alright, liberation of Supreme Court justices. So Nixon criticized the Warren Court for being too liberal, and 4 justices retired, and Nixon chose replacements that were all conservatives. He also named Warren Burger as the Chief Justice. Alright, let's look at Nixon and the economy. Stagflation is the high inflation and high unemployment. Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam War were funded with deficit spending. So competition in world trade led to a flood of new workers and dependency on foreign oil all caused issues of stagflation. Creation of OPEC was formed in the 60s and increased the price of oil in the Southwest Asia. Nixon also tried to reverse deficit spending by raising taxes and cutting the budget, but Congress would not accept his plan. He also tries to confront the inflation issue by reducing the amount of money in circulation and raising the interest rates. Nixon controlled all the wages and prices, but the recession continued. OPEC and war. During the 60s, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries raised the price of oil, and the 6 Days War in 1967 also impacted prices, and then the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel, Egypt, and Syria rose prices, and when the U.S. sent massive military aid to Israel, the Arab OPEC nations cut oil sales to the United States, which started an oil embargo, and by 1974 the price increased 4 times. And there were major gas lines and shortages in the United States in the early mid-1970s. So you can see the gas lines here. Nixon's foreign policy goals. Nixon's top priority was peace in Vietnam and significant advances in U.S. relationships with China and the Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger was his Secretary of State, and together he and Nixon adopted a policy of realpolitik, or political realism, and that foreign policy should be based on power, not ideology. And if a weak country falls to communism, they're to ignore it. So this leads to a departure from containment, and that the U.S. should confront powerful nations, where negotiations and or military engagement. They also adopted a policy of détente, where they made a more flexible approach to communist nations and helped ease Cold War tensions. Nixon visits China in 1972, which helped open up diplomatic and economic ties, and each country both made agreements that neither will dominate the Pacific, and Taiwan would eventually reunite with China. Since 1949, the U.S. had not recognized the Communist Chinese government, and with ping-pong diplomacy began in 1971. Nixon wanted to play the China card and take advantage of the rift between the Chinese and the Soviet Union. Nixon's visit to China was going to become a symbolic and open diplomatic and economic relations, and both countries will cooperate and participate in scientific and cultural exchanges. There's Air Force One and all the Chinese soldiers. Alright, in 1972, Nixon also visits Moscow and the Soviet Union. And Nixon will sign, he and Brezhnev, the leader of Soviet Union, will sign what's called SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the number of intercontinental missiles. And then by 1972, peace was at hand in Vietnam, but what we already know is by then peace was still very much elusive to what it should have been. Okay. And, well, there we go. There's the picture of the two of them together. Nixon and Brezhnev. Let's see, is there pictures? I guess I don't have another. I should put some pictures of, anyway. That's all.